Karen's face flushed a deep crimson as she stomped across her neighbor's neatly manicured lawn, her fists clenched tightly at her sides. The Homeowners Association meeting had just adjourned, and she was livid. How dare they deny her request to install a 12-foot privacy fence around her property? It was her right as a homeowner to do as she pleased, and she refused to be dictated to by a bunch of busybodies. "This is an outrage," she bellowed, her shrill voice piercing the tranquil suburban air. "I pay my dues on time every month, and this is the thanks I get. Well, I'll show them who's in charge around here." Without hesitation, Karen marched over to the freshly planted azalea bushes lining her neighbor's driveway and began ripping them out of the ground, the delicate petals scattering in the breeze. Her neighbor, a kindly elderly man named Mr. Johnson, came rushing out of his house, his face etched with a mixture of shock and horror. "Mrs. Wilkins, what on earth are you doing?" he cried, hurrying towards her. Karen whirled around, her eyes narrowed to slits. "Stay out of this, Mr. Johnson. This is between me and the HOA. They can't tell me what to do on my own property, and I'm going to make sure they know it." She turned back to the bushes, her fingers clawing at the soil as she continued to uproot them, heedless of Mr. Johnson's desperate pleas for her to stop. The sound of her frantic digging and the crunch of the delicate stems filled the air, and Karen could feel the anger coursing through her veins. Just then, the front door of the Johnsons' house burst open, and their young grandson, Tommy, came running out, his eyes wide with fear. "Grandpa, what's happening?" he cried, his voice trembling. Mr. Johnson hurried to his grandson's side, wrapping a protective arm around him. "It's all right, Tommy," he said, his voice soothing. "Mrs. Wilkins is just having a bit of a disagreement with the HOA. Why don't you go inside and play for a while?" But Karen was having none of it. She whirled around, her eyes wild, and pointed an accusatory finger at the boy. "This is all your fault," she spat. "If it weren't for your stupid azalea bushes, I wouldn't be in this mess." Tommy recoiled in terror, his small body trembling as Karen's venomous gaze fell upon him. Mr. Johnson stepped in front of the boy, shielding him from the unhinged woman's wrath. Now, Mrs. Wilkins, let's not do anything rash," he said, his voice quivering slightly. "I'm sure we can find a way to resolve this matter civilly." Karen let out a derisive snort, her lips curling into a sneer. "Civilly? Ha! That ship has sailed, Mr. Johnson. The HOA made their decision, and now they're going to pay the price." Without warning, she reached into her purse and pulled out a can of gasoline, unscrewing the cap with a determined twist of her wrist. Mr. Johnson's eyes widened in horror as he realized her sinister intent. "Mrs. Wilkins, no," he cried, rushing towards her. "Think about what you're doing." But Karen was beyond reason. With a malicious grin, she began dousing the azalea bushes, the pungent fumes filling the air. Mr. Johnson grabbed her arm, trying to wrestle the can from her grasp, but she was surprisingly strong, her fury fueling her actions. Suddenly, a small voice broke through the chaos. "Grandpa, I'm scared," Tommy whimpered, his eyes brimming with tears. The sound of his grandson's fear seemed to momentarily snap Mr. Johnson out of his panic, and he turned his attention to the boy, wrapping him in a protective embrace. "It's going to be all right, Tommy," he said, his voice trembling. "I won't let anything happen to you." Karen watched the tender scene with a twisted sense of satisfaction, her fingers tightening around the gasoline can. With a swift motion, she hurled it towards the azalea bushes, the contents spilling out in a wide arc. Mr. Johnson's eyes widened in horror as he realized what was about to happen. "No," he cried, his voice laced with desperation. The gasoline hit the ground with a dull thud, and in an instant, the bushes erupted in flames, the orange tongues of fire licking hungrily at the dry leaves and stems. The sudden burst of flames sent Tommy into a panic, the young boy's cries of terror piercing the air. Mr. Johnson immediately swept him up in his arms, shielding him from the raging inferno as best he could. Karen, however, stood transfixed, her eyes wide with a twisted sense of triumph. She had won, at least for the moment, and she reveled in the chaos she had unleashed. The roar of the flames and the acrid smell of burning foliage only seemed to fuel her twisted delight. But the moment was short-lived, as the sound of sirens in the distance quickly shattered her reverie. Karen's heart raced as she realized the consequences of her actions were about to catch up with her. She had to get out of there, and fast. Casting one last malicious glance towards the Johnsons, she turned on her heel and bolted, her feet pounding against the pavement as she fled the scene. Behind her, the flames continued to spread, licking at the wooden fence that separated the two properties. Mr. Johnson, his face etched with fear and desperation, rushed to his front door, still clutching the trembling Tommy in his arms. "Call the fire department," he shouted to his wife, who had emerged from the house, her eyes wide with shock. Mrs. Johnson wasted no time, hurrying back inside to make the emergency call. Mr. Johnson, meanwhile, set Tommy down and grabbed a garden hose, desperately trying to douse the flames before they could consume his home. The roar of the fire and the wail of the approaching sirens filled the air, and Karen could feel her heart pounding in her chest as she darted down the street, her mind racing. She couldn't go home, the police would be there in minutes, and she knew she'd be the prime suspect. No, she had to find somewhere to hide, to escape the consequences of her actions. As she rounded the corner, Karen's eyes fell upon an abandoned warehouse, its windows boarded up and its doors left ajar. Without hesitation, she slipped inside, the darkness enveloping her as she tried to catch her breath. Karen crouched in the shadows of the abandoned warehouse, her heart pounding in her chest. The sound of the approaching fire engines and the shouting voices of the first responders sent a surge of panic through her. She had to get out of here, but the thought of facing the consequences of her actions filled her with dread. Cautiously, she peered out a boarded-up window, watching as the fire trucks pulled up to the scene. Firefighters quickly sprang into action, unrolling hoses and dousing the flames that were now threatening to consume the Johnsons' home. Karen's stomach twisted with a mixture of fear and guilt, but she quickly pushed those feelings aside. "This is all their fault," she muttered to herself, her fingers clenching into fists. "If they had just let me have my way, none of this would have happened." Suddenly, a familiar voice caught her attention, and Karen's eyes widened in horror. It was her neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, who was standing on the sidewalk, gesturing frantically as she spoke to one of the firefighters. "I saw the whole thing," Karen heard her exclaim. "That crazy woman, Mrs. Wilkins, she just started tearing up my azalea bushes, and then set them on fire. You have to catch her before she gets away." Karen's heart raced as she realized that her neighbor had seen the entire incident unfold. She had to get out of here, and fast. Casting one last look out the window, she turned and began searching the warehouse for an exit, her mind racing with a desperate plan. As she made her way through the dimly lit space, Karen's eyes landed on a set of old, rusted tools, including a crowbar and a hammer. A twisted smile spread across her face as she grabbed them, clutching them tightly in her hands. "If those fools think they can stop me, they have another thing coming," she hissed, her voice dripping with venom. With a renewed sense of determination, Karen began searching for a way out of the warehouse, ready to do whatever it took to escape the consequences of her actions. Karen's heart pounded in her chest as she gripped the crowbar and hammer tightly, her knuckles turning white. The sound of the sirens and the frantic voices outside only heightened her sense of desperation. She had to get out of this warehouse and away from the scene of the crime before the police caught up with her. Steeling her nerves, Karen began to cautiously make her way through the shadowy interior of the abandoned building. The air was thick with the scent of dust and decay, and the creaking of the old wooden beams overhead only added to the eerie atmosphere. As she rounded a corner, Karen's eyes landed on a set of double doors that seemed to lead to an exit. Excitement surged through her, and she quickened her pace, her grip on the tools tightening with each step. But just as she reached the doors, a sudden movement in the corner of her eye made her freeze. Whirling around, she found herself face to face with a homeless man, his eyes wide with fear and his body hunched in the corner. "Please, don't hurt me," the man pleaded, his voice trembling. Karen's eyes narrowed, and a twisted sense of power washed over her. Here was someone who was even more powerless than she was, someone she could use to her advantage. "Well, what do we have here?" she purred, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Looks like you've got yourself in a bit of a predicament, don't you?" The man cowered, his eyes darting around the warehouse, as if searching for an escape. Karen felt a surge of adrenaline, the tools in her hands suddenly feeling like a source of strength. "Now, you're going to do exactly as I say," she hissed, her voice low and menacing. "And if you try to stop me, well, let's just say you're going to regret it." The man's eyes widened in terror, and Karen knew she had him right where she wanted him. With a twisted grin, she began to formulate her plan of escape, determined to evade the clutches of the law at all costs. The homeless man's eyes darted around the warehouse, his body trembling with fear as Karen loomed over him, the crowbar and hammer clutched tightly in her hands. "Please, I don't want any trouble," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Karen's lips curled into a sinister smile, her eyes glinting with a twisted sense of power. "Oh, I'm sure you don't," she purred, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "But you're going to help me, whether you like it or not." The man's throat constricted, and he swallowed hard, his mind racing as he tried to figure out a way to escape the unhinged woman's clutches. What do you want me to do?" he asked, his voice trembling. Karen's grip tightened on the tools, and she leaned in closer, her breath hot on the man's face. "I need you to create a distraction," she hissed. "Draw the attention of those firefighters and cops outside while I make my escape." The man's eyes widened in horror, and he shook his head frantically. "No, I can't do that. They'll arrest me." Karen's lips twisted into a snarl, and she raised the crowbar menacingly. "Then I guess you leave me no choice," she growled. The man's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the weapon, his mind racing with a desperate plan. Suddenly, an idea struck him, and he forced himself to meet Karen's gaze. Okay, I'll do it," he said, his voice quavering. "But you have to promise to leave me alone after that." Karen considered his request for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Fine," she said, a hint of triumph in her voice. "Just make sure you keep those cops and firefighters busy, understood?" The man nodded, his stomach churning with fear and resignation. As Karen stepped back, he took a deep breath and began to shout, his voice echoing through the warehouse. "Help! Help! Somebody please help me." Karen watched with a twisted sense of satisfaction as the man's cries drew the attention of the first responders outside. Gripping the tools tightly, she turned and bolted towards the exit, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. Karen's heart pounded in her chest as she burst through the double doors of the abandoned warehouse, the crowbar and hammer clutched tightly in her hands. The sound of the homeless man's frantic cries echoed behind her, drawing the attention of the firefighters and police officers who were still battling the blaze at the Johnsons' home. Casting a hasty glance over her shoulder, Karen saw the first responders begin to converge on the warehouse, their sirens wailing and their voices calling out in confusion. She knew she had to act fast if she was going to escape undetected. Darting down the alley, Karen kept low, her eyes scanning the area for a possible getaway vehicle. She spotted an old, beat-up sedan, parked a few blocks away, and without hesitation, made a beeline for it. Pulling the crowbar from her pocket, she quickly pried open the car door and slid into the driver's seat, her trembling fingers fumbling with the ignition. Just as the engine roared to life, Karen caught sight of a police officer in her rearview mirror, his face etched with determination as he sprinted towards her. Panic surged through her, and she slammed her foot on the gas, the car lurching forward with a startling jerk. The officer shouted something, but the sound of the engine drowned out his words. Karen gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles turning white as she weaved through the narrow streets, her eyes darting from side to side in search of a way to lose her pursuer. As she rounded a sharp corner, the car's tires squealed in protest, and Karen felt her heart leap into her throat. She was running out of options, and the thought of being caught and facing the consequences of her actions filled her with a sense of dread. Suddenly, an idea struck her, and she made a sharp turn down a deserted alley, the car's tires kicking up a cloud of dust. She knew this area well, having used it as a shortcut to avoid traffic on numerous occasions. If she could just stay one step ahead of the officer, she might just be able to slip away unnoticed. Karen's heart pounded in her chest as she navigated the twisting, narrow alley, the old sedan's engine straining with every sharp turn. She could still hear the wail of the police siren in the distance, a constant reminder of the threat that loomed behind her. As she rounded a particularly tight corner, Karen caught sight of a familiar landmark, the back entrance to the community center she frequented. A glimmer of hope flickered in her chest, and she quickly steered the car towards the entrance, praying that it would provide her with the escape she so desperately needed. Pulling up to the metal gate, Karen frantically searched for a way to open it. Her eyes landed on a keypad, and without hesitation, she began punching in the access code she had memorized from her numerous visits. The gate groaned as it swung open, and Karen wasted no time in guiding the car through, the tires crunching against the gravel. Once inside, she parked the car in a secluded corner, her eyes darting around the empty lot as she tried to catch her breath. The sound of the siren had faded, and for a moment, she allowed herself to feel a sense of relief. But that relief was short-lived as the reality of her situation sank in. She had just committed arson, destroyed private property, and evaded the police, all in the span of a few frantic minutes. The weight of her actions threatened to crush her, and she felt a wave of guilt and remorse wash over her. As she sat there, her hands trembling, Karen knew she couldn't hide forever. Sooner or later, the authorities would catch up with her, and she would have to face the consequences of her unhinged tantrum. But for now, she was safe, hidden away in the shadows of the community center. Closing her eyes, Karen tried to steady her breathing, her mind racing with a million thoughts. What would happen to her now? How would she explain her actions to the HOA, to her neighbors, to the law? The uncertainty of it all filled her with a sense of dread, but she knew she had no one to blame but herself. With a heavy sigh, Karen opened her eyes and gazed out at the empty lot, her heart heavy with the weight of her choices. The adventure might be over, but the real challenge was only just beginning.